All right, so finally back to answer probably one of the most commonly asked questions, and this has to do with sort of a variety of angles, right? So one particular is trying to understand classical polytheism in light of what, contemporary monotheist religions tend to think about God. And then, particularly for myself, the import and the connection of Stoic theology and how it corresponds to what we might consider the traditional gods, right? Um, so, uh, within Stoic physics, there's these sort of primordial substances, right? There's these two. Um, Traditionally, if you look online, Stoicism is more times than not associated with the term monism, right? But that's probably not the most accurate descriptor, um, because they essentially do have two principles that facilitate the entirety of the cosmos, right, or of everything, right? And these are the active and passive principles, right? The active principle um, is the logos, sometimes just called God or fate, providence, nature, or in uh, the ancient Greco-Roman world, they called that Zeus, right? Um, the passive is what we might consider uh, inert matter, right? Now, both of these principles are what we might consider corporeal. They have substance to them. But the substance of the active principle was pneuma, right? This is a fancy term in the Greco-Roman world, but to make that connection a little bit closer to home, in the book of what is it? I think it's the Gospel of John in the New Testament, whenever he says that God is spirit, right? That word spirit's translated from the Greek word pneuma. And this is because the early Christians were rather obsessed with Stoic and Platonic philosophy, right? But that's because everyone was at the time, right? So the Roman Empire was heavily Stoic. And so Stoic values are going to sort of bleed through. Um, Now, so like I said, both of those are corporeal substances, and they comprise essentially everything, everything. And the way the Stoics understood it was that there was an intermixture between the active and passive that sort of creates everything that is, right? And this is where you kind of get the um, more modern classification of Stoicism as a sort of pantheistic philosophy. Um, I think that you could also use terms like panentheistic. Um, but then you run into issues, right? So within modern Stoic communities, um, try going in there and asking them what they think about polytheism. Most of them can't even figure out whether or not they think the universe is providentially governed, which uh, pretty much every scholar of Stoicism I'm aware of, and of course, all the original source material assumes that that's the case, right? If you don't have providence, you don't have God or gods, fate, nature, logos, then you don't have the Stoic ethics. The Stoic project falls apart. It's pretty unique in that capacity, and the Stoics understood that. It understood it that way. Um, now, when it comes to polytheism, the way the Stoics understood it was that while we do have this sort of primordial active principle, logos, pneuma, Zeus, etc., that sort of penetrates and permeates the material cosmos, um, that manifests itself in a variety of different ways. So the project within Stoicism, if you look at it historically, was essentially it appealed to the common person. And in appealing to the common person, they weren't outright saying that the traditional gods, the traditional pantheon of gods that you would have understood in the Greco-Roman world, didn't exist. They very much did think that they existed. And the majority of the project of the early arguments from Zeno and Chrysippus and Cleanthes and the like even all the way down to Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, the Stoic interlocutor there, seems to suggest that there are multiple gods, not one, multiple. And that seems to be their project, is to maintain the traditional religion. And so in the same way, this is how I've understood my approach to polytheism. Many have asked, how did I end up where I was? Given that I come from a Christian ministerial background and teaching Christian apologetics. Well, it first started with I needed an intellectual basis to facilitate growing out of Christianity. And then, of course, sort of like a flower garden. If you want a new religious tradition to grow out of it, you need to make sense of it, at least from my perspective. And so that sort of soil grounding foundation was Stoic philosophy, right? And so Stoic philosophy facilitated my intellectual exit from Christianity. And that's for a variety of reasons. I've talked about in other videos about the justice and forgiveness bit and Seneca's take on that, and how I completely agreed with him. And I think that he does it way better than, say, guys like Jesus. So I won't bore you with that here. But I used Stoic physics to make sense of my own polytheistic understandings of theology, right? And so the way scholars have oftentimes talked about this is you sort of put it in categories. We have the cosmic God. I'd probably put font over this if I wanted to edit these videos, but I'm not. I'm too lazy for that. But we might call it the cosmic God, which is sort of this prime facilitator and prime mover to some degree. If you want sort of more details on that, I've written a blog on it, but you probably would be just better off reading Seneca. Seneca's got a letter on causes that would be excellent. You might want to take up there. He criticizes Plato and Aristotle, and he gives his own perspective, and I very much tend to agree with him on it. Very simple stuff. We have the cosmic God, which is oftentimes in regular conversation what I might refer to as the God of the philosophers, and that's sort of the overarching, right? And then sometimes that will get conflated with these sort of top of the pantheon gods, and more traditionally in the Greco-Roman world, Zeus. But if you study ancient history, Zeus gets conflated with a lot of gods. One of the most obvious, I've shared this image a million times now, but from a Cushion depiction of, I believe it's 3rd century, there is a syncretism depiction of syncretism between Zeus and Ahura Mazda, the Zoroastrian high god, right? And there are similar metaphysical layouts for how the Stoics understood theology to how the Zoroastrians did. To some degree, there's nuance, but so that primordial principle would oftentimes be associated with this high god, and then you would have almost universally in the ancient world a sort of top down, right? So you have these other deities that are either produced out of, there's usually mythical explanations for how these other deities come to be, whether it be through marriage and child rearing, because that's of course how we understand producing other living beings. And so that's how these personified, anthropomorphized deities would do it. Now, whether or not that's physically how that happens, not really something I would probably take a side in. I don't know how we'd even know that. But that's definitely how we understood it. And that's usually the function of myth, as it allegorizes these more complex mechanistic or biological components of the cosmos, right? Humans desire more than just rudimentary explanations. We want to know. So, and so, yeah, that's how these other gods would be manifest. And so that's traditionally how I've actually understood Mesopotamian theology. The more you engage with some of the scholarship, it's not a lot, but some of the scholarship that tries to engage with how the Mesopotamians understood their gods, it looks more and more to me, and I don't want to be anachronistic, but scholars do oftentimes reference Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, and a lot of Mesopotamian literature to try to understand and discern the physics behind how the ancients viewed their gods and their relationship to the material cosmos. Now, I've talked about this before, but oftentimes I think that the best word to use would be like immanent. Now, are they identical? Like, are they identical with their what we might call physical manifestations, their theophanies? Probably not. But I do think that Stoic physics can make sense of that in the sense that we could talk about the gods' bodies physically um, as pneumatic, comprised of pneuma, the divine substance, you know, and they're the active principle in and underneath these physical manifestations, oftentimes depicted as the earth or water or a planet or the sky. I'm in my mind here, I'm thinking of like the god On. He's the highest god of the pantheon, and it wouldn't be too far-fetched to say that he, could be this primordial active principle or to be identified with that, depending on which myth you look at. Or in some early and Sumerian iterations, the goddess Namu being sort of this prime mover. Or in the later Babylonian, certainly it could be Marduk. These would not be too outlandish to say. And the Stoics tried to, different ones come up with different um, makeups for how this would work, all the way down to Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and Zeno positing different hegemonicons, sort of like these uh, leading faculties of the cosmos. Like, where is the cosmos? What is the cosmos following here? And Cleanthes, I believe it was the one who said he thinks it might be the sun, and so the sun is comprised of the god Helios. Which is, if you look in some ancient literature, he's oftentimes syncretized with Mithra from Persia, and then Shamash or Utu from Mesopotamia. So there's a lot of carryover, right? Um, and so that's generally how I've understood the theological paradigm there. Um, in the same way, just sort of uh, put a nice bow on this video. Uh, a heavily commonly associated question with this one asks about something I think I've responded to a little bit in the past, but uh, it's a question about the perfection of the gods, right? And I may talk about this a little bit more in another video, but I wanted to just sort of dovetail onto that real quick and suggest that the issue of perfection for me is it's almost like a non-starter, because more times than not, perfection doesn't even seem to have a clear definition for most people. Um, if you mean just maximally great, that in and of itself seems to fall flat. I mean, I don't even know what you might mean by that. And then I would oftentimes say that inherent within that question is a lot of Platonic assumptions that I don't buy, particularly this idea that the good is something like abstract and out there. Whereas I would probably say that if it doesn't consist of a body, it probably doesn't actually exist. And so if you put the good out there, whatever that might mean, sort of in the Platonic sense or some incorporeal, immaterial, whatever, um, well then, well then no, the gods are not like that. So, the gods really do exist. And what I would say, and what I have said to that question of like perfection, um, is, well, one, like I said, it's a non-starter. It's a useless term. I don't know what you mean by that. Um, but what we could say is because of the function the gods have, and this is important because I don't think the gods are like, say some Catholics would say, like Thomas Aquinas. I don't think the gods are being qua being or being itself, to play in some of the language of divine simplicity. I honestly think that that's just a lot of philosophical wordplay. I don't think it has much bearing in reality. But instead, the gods are a species of being. And if they are a species of being, then they have certain functions. If they have certain functions, then we can make those functions excellent. And it definitely seems to be within the language of what Seneca is trying to discuss when he says the gods, what the gods are by nature, we essentially can arrive at through strife and suffering and struggle, so which is, virtue. So if you mean, are the gods good? Well, then the answer is definitely yes. The gods are just, good, holy, and worthy of worship. Uh, but oftentimes when we say perfect, I think we just mean, well, just something incomprehensible to some degree. And that's certainly not where I would say that I'm at. Um, and so to sort of wrap that all up, yeah, I think that Stoic physics um, breathe intellectual life into polytheism, and they bring it down to earth in such a way as I think that words like immanent would be far more sufficient than, say, words like transcendent when we talk about the metaphysical or physical nature of the gods, right? Now, I don't have problems with the word transcendent to some capacity just because we use that language in many ways to mean something higher than ourselves, right? The gods are certainly higher, but I would just say that they're a higher species of being than humans, mostly because they're not humans. So, um, they created us. And so humans have a human nature, right? Um, and the Stoics wanted to suggest, going all the way back to Zeno, that the cosmos has a divine nature. And what that divine nature looks like, well, is what we've been detailing here in this video. And so um, I think as we move forward in some of these videos, especially whenever people ask questions, because I've been getting this question a lot too, and I'll probably address it later, but this question about, um, if I'm going to say a God's better than another God, or if there's a sort of comparison to be had, well, to what effect are we comparing them? What do we mean when we say a God is good? Good relative to what? And that assumes a type of function. And so naturally, that falls back to suggest what is the function of the gods. So maybe in another video, I can take that up. I think that's really interesting. But I hope that this is in some way helpful, just because I feel like this sort of sphere of questions is the ones I come up against so many times. And yeah, yeah.